Welcome to Game Design Hour, the podcast where I interview the people behind the video games you love. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Wren Brier. She's the creative director behind the hit game Unpacking. Today's episode was sponsored by Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs, or you can head on over to their website, hoffmanswoodstuffs.net, by clicking the link in the description. Stick around until the end of the episode to find out how you can get 20% off your next order. Let's get into the interview. Hello.
Hey.
Hi, thanks for doing the interview today.
No worries. It's nice to meet you.
It's good to meet you too. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good.
When did you first realize you wanted to work in the video game industry?
I think when I was 18, I wanted to work in animation since I was about 13. And I always knew I wanted to be an artist. But games, even though I loved playing games, it never occurred to me that I could work in games as an artist until I was 18 and looking at universities. And one of those universities was like a university for like games courses and like game specific. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess that's something I could do. I still thought I'd be going into like film animation even when I went there, but I really enjoyed all the games related courses. Like there were game design courses and like classes that we had to take. And so I was like getting more and more into it and eventually ended up working in games.
After college, how did you first get into the industry?
It was pretty rough, honestly. So I started college in 2008, which is when the global financial crisis happened. And I live in Brisbane in Australia, and we had a really booming industry at the time, but it collapsed when the global financial crisis hit because Australia actually did fine in the crisis, but all of the studios were owned by overseas companies or relied on overseas contracts. So as soon as that happened, contracts dried up. And when companies overseas were looking at which sub-studios to shutter, it was the ones here. So when I graduated, there was almost like just nowhere to go. So at first, I just looked for work for a while and worked like a lot of odd jobs, not even quite in games. And the ones that were in games were like part-time and, didn't last for very long. But eventually I did another degree. Then I managed to finally see that there was finally a job ad for a junior artist at a local company. And I applied for that and got in. That was at Half Brick.
How did the idea for Unpacking first originate?
So it's a very personal kind of game. It started when my partner Tim moved in with me and we were unpacking his stuff. Something about that felt very game-like, like you take things out of one box and finish emptying it, and that unlocks the box underneath. And then you can take stuff out of that one and you complete sets of items between boxes. And there's like a sense of surprise and delight when things come out. And in general, like in a lot of games, essentially what you end up doing is creating order out of chaos. And in Unpacking, you do that in a very literal sense. We knew we wanted to tell a story because you can tell a lot about a person from the items that they own. And we decided to use the concept to tell a story of one character through the different moves in her life from childhood to adulthood.
How large was the team that worked on Unpacking?
Quite small. So the core team, like the three stakeholders, I guess, are me, Tim, and Jeff Van Dyke. So Jeff Van Dyke is our sound and music director. Tim is the technical director, and I'm the creative director. But we all like wear many hats and do a lot of different roles, and our roles overlap a lot. Like both me and Tim worked on the game design and narrative. So in addition to that, we had Angus, who was our primary artist who did the majority of the pixel art in the game. You could say like the core team was 4 people, but then we had a few contractors here and there. So the total number of people who probably like touched Unpacking is about 8, but mainly 4 people.
How long did you and the team spend working on the story of Unpacking?
I think it was like a long process through the entire game, but the core beats of the story we nailed really, really early on. So we had the idea that there would be 7 moves and what each one of those moves would be about a week after we had the idea for the game. And then we added like another one in the middle, Parent House. That was that was not there in the original plan, but it felt missing until we added it. So we added that about a year later. But adding like all the details to the story, making like fleshing out the characters, figuring out all of the items that they own and all their interests and things like that, that was an ongoing process that kept going for the entirety of development.
What were some of the biggest inspirations and pieces of media that inspired Unpacking?
So usually I name like 3 games and 1 song. So the 3 games would be Florence. I don't know if you know Florence. It's a mobile game. It's absolutely lovely, and it's a love story from the perspective of a female character. And like her story is told with like pretty much no words. It's all images and like mechanics and things like that, but very like mobile oriented. So like, slide your finger on the screen and stuff. So that was a big inspiration. Like I wanted to tell a story of a female character using very few words and mainly game mechanics and visuals. Another inspiration was Gone Home. So that's a lovely PC game about a character who comes home after a year abroad and no one is home. And she's trying to piece together what happened to the family from just the household items that you find there. Now, Gone Home has like a lot more high fidelity than Unpacking, where everything is just pixel art and there's like no words. In Gone Home, you've got audio diaries and you've got like written text in like notes that you find and things like that. And you're a character like exploring one big static space, whereas Unpacking like takes you through different points in a character's life. So, it's not quite the same, but definitely a lot of inspiration for telling environmental storytelling. And then the third one would be The Sims. So just the original Sims where everything was isometric and, just building houses, organizing them, making them nice. That element definitely exists in Unpacking. And then the song that inspired Unpacking is called The Bed Song by Amanda Palmer. It's a song that like follows a relationship of 2 people from when they're young to till really the end of their lives, told through snapshots, only through the different beds that they've had throughout their relationship. So from sharing a sleeping bag to, a mattress on the floor to like their first nice fancy bed, all the way to the end. And it's a very emotional and beautiful song and tells such a nice story through so little and just these snapshots, and gives you so much insight into these characters' lives. So, I really wanted to do something like that.
Did you always plan to tell a story using Unpacking, or was there ever a point where you considered not telling a story?
I'd say the story was pretty essential. Yeah, like the mechanic came first, but the story came almost immediately after. There was one point where like really, really early on, we considered having different characters that like you just unpack their one room. And so you learn about them through that. They were going to be much more shallow little stories. And we decided we could tell a better and bigger story if we followed one character instead.
Were there any interesting ideas that were talked about at one point, but just ended up getting cut?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say my favorite one that got cut was we were hoping we could put a cat in the game. And, and the cat could kind of loaf on a box, and you'd have to pick the cat up and put it down somewhere, and it would be really well behaved and not walk around or anything. It'll just sit there stationary, but when you go to a different room and come back, it'll be sitting elsewhere, or it might move rooms as well, and it would have like a preference for sitting on boxes, so you'd always have to remove the cat first from the box when you get into a room. It ended up getting cut because it was like very just out of scope. It would have been a lot of work for a very small feature at the end of the day.
What went into the decisions of the level locations and dates that were chosen?
So the level locations and the years, the biggest consideration was we wanted to pick a time that would be familiar to us. So I'm 32 and Tim's a bit older than me. And this character is like a little bit older than me and a bit younger than Tim. It's like somewhere in the middle. So we wanted her experiences to draw a lot on our personal experiences and the things we were familiar with. So the story starts in the 90s with like toys and things that are familiar to us. And when the character is, I think she ends up being a little older than I am right now, or maybe by now, it's my age, I'm not sure anymore. And then the locations was kind of a similar situation where we wanted to tell a story about places that are familiar to us. So the whole story is actually set in Brisbane, which is Brisbane in Australia, which is the town that we live in. It's like different suburbs of Brisbane. And like, for example, the boyfriend apartment is like right in the central business district, in like a tall skyscraper. And the solo apartment, the one where you move out on your own, is set in this area called Tenerife, which has a lot of big wool sheds that have been converted into apartment buildings. It's kind of a hipster area. So like there's all of these are areas in and around Brisbane. More specifically, like some of these apartments draw on places that we've lived, and like some furniture that we've had appears in the game. But one funny thing about the timeline is that originally the story was supposed to end in 2020, which was the original planned release date for the game. But then actual real life 2020 happened. And we were like, you know what? We don't want to end this story in a pandemic. That would be really depressing. And we also don't want to have like a weird alternate universe where the pandemic didn't happen. And then we're like, 2019 is still a little too close. Like it's like, oh, the story ends well, but what will happen next year? Oh no. So it's like, we moved it back to 2018.
Did you have to do any sort of research of the sort into apartment layouts and what that sort of stuff looks like?
Oh yeah, a lot. Yeah. So I don't really consider myself an environment artist. I'm actually a character artist, which is kind of weird it's kind of a weird choice to make a game about like no characters at all, or, at least no characters that you can see. But, I rose to the challenge, and definitely like Tim helped me a bunch. We would like brainstorm a lot of things together, and definitely like the other artists on the team did a tremendous job. But yeah, I designed all the room layouts myself, and I definitely felt a little out of my depth, and I did a lot of Googling for like floor plans and kind of drawing inspiration from like real people's houses and layouts that I could find on the internet. I also had this, there's this website called dimensions.guide, which came in very, very handy for Unpacking's development, which just provides you dimensions for just a ton of household objects and such. But yeah, I now know things like how wide and tall a door is, and that can actually vary between countries a little bit. What kind of dimensions skirting boards have, and like I know the construction of like apartments a lot better than I used to before this.
Were there any bigger interesting bugs or glitches that you and the team came across while working on Unpacking?
I think the worst of them were in the replay system. I don't know if you've had a chance to play around with it, but there's a system in the game that lets you either record GIFs of the levels that you played through, or just like watch a replay of them that you can record to video if you want. It just plays back everything you did really, really fast. And it was a tricky system for Tim to implement. And it does things in a very brute force way. Like it just does step after step of all the thing. It replicates everything that the player did. Mm-hmm. And if anything goes wrong in one step, the whole thing gets derailed. So you'd get things like shoes being placed in the wall, and books being kind of like overlapping with each other, and items just turning into like gray squares and such, because there wasn't art for that rotation, like it didn't exist. So that one was just a ton of testing, and then Tim fixing every bug that I found.
What was it like working on a video game during the pandemic?
So the biggest thing was like at the start of development, it was like right before the pandemic. We started working on this game in 2018, and we traveled a lot with the game. We went to Sweden for a Games Accelerator program for 2 months. We showed the game in Melbourne, in Japan, in San Francisco, just kind of like all over the place. And then the pandemic started and we couldn't go anywhere anymore. And it's like really depressing. It was really fun doing like this indie adventure and like going and meeting other developers and like networking and showing the game and seeing people react to it. And suddenly we're just at home all the time, just working. Actually pretty good for our productivity because traveling a lot was, other than to Stugan, in Sweden, which was for working on the game there, traveling a lot as an indie was kind of disruptive to development. Like you go away for a week and it eats up like a week on either side of the trip with other stuff. But yeah, so it did mean that when the pandemic started, our development process became a little bit more productive and uninterrupted. But it was also, kind of sad and depressing. So our mental health was probably not the best, and sometimes it slowed us down. The game is nominated for a lot of awards, and it's been really exciting for us. And we've booked tickets to go to GDC this year, which is in late March. And we're giving a talk there and everything, and we don't know if we'll be able to go. So that's the tough part.
Besides the cat, were there any other interesting objects that got cut from the game?
There was one that got accidentally cut right at the end. So we lost the boyfriend's laptop. There was a laptop for the boyfriend in that apartment on the coffee table. And we just forgot to pack it in a box, like in our game. So it didn't make it. It would have made that level just a tiny bit harder. But oh well, what can you do? As for other objects, we really cut very few things. Like we planned out the objects quite early. Like if things were cut, it was at the stage before they even like had placeholder art in the game generally. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, so I'm sure there were some things. It would be like not particularly interesting things generally got cut. Like the boyfriend had a couple pairs of jeans, and we got rid of those and replaced them with one pair of chinos because we wanted because it was hard for players to tell apart the boyfriend's jeans from your main character's jeans. So to add some more differentiation between them, we were like, all right, he has chinos. And we were also like slimming down the closets to not have quite as many clothes. So that was mainly the kind of stuff we removed, like when you had excess items that took up too much space and weren't that interesting. The underwear had a lot of revisions because turns out it was quite hard to tell apart folded underwear from the folded socks. And a lot of people still struggle with that. But they are easier to differentiate now than they used to be.
Unpacking does a great job of telling its story without using any dialogue. Can you tell me a bit about what went into the decision to not use any dialogue?
It didn't feel necessary. Yeah, there was a certain level of minimalism that we wanted to approach this game with, and just we didn't want to clutter it with anything it didn't need. The items we felt were doing a good job at telling the story. And if we told people, like, if we had little labels for each of the items, for example, which is something that we have had people ask about, if we could add those, it would take away from, like, the puzzle of the game, really, and from the amount of attention that people pay when they look at the items. So when you look at an item and it has a label that says, this is a sketchbook, then you're not going to analyze the item. You're going to go, oh, this is a sketchbook. Like, it may as well be a placeholder, like cube with the word sketchbook on it, because like people will not pay attention to the visual. The visual will become secondary. It'll become like just decoration instead of part of the game design and part of the story. So we never wanted to add labels. The only words we really have in the game from the protagonist are the lines in the photo album that like she has something to say about each room in each apartment. You can like finish on different rooms in the different levels and you get a different line. So that's all the text we wanted to give, because we wanted to help contextualize the apartments a little bit and give you a little bit of flavor of like what the character's personality is. But for the most part, it just didn't feel necessary. And then the other aspect of it was accessibility. Maybe it's partly because English is actually not my first language. My first language is Hebrew, and I didn't speak English until I was 9 or so, maybe 8, I don't know. And playing games as a kid, they may as well not have had text, because no one localizes games into Hebrew, let alone, back then. So I played all my games in English and I couldn't read, so they may as well have had no text at all. And only the games that worked without text were games I could play. And so we have this game that's really approachable and very easy to play. And if we bog it down with text, we're making a lot of people, like little kids or people who don't speak the languages that the game is localized to, we're locking them out of the experience. So if we can do this without words, then why not?
Sorry to pop in here, but I wanted to let you know about today's sponsor, Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs. You can also check out their website, hoffmanswoodstuffs.net, by using the link in the description. Stick around at the end of the episode to find out how you can get 20% off your next order. Let's get back into the interview. What is the strangest object placement you have seen a player do?
A knife in the bathroom, things like that. Or, I think the weirdest one that I saw recently was someone put Piggy in the shower. I was like, no, why would you do that to him?
Which parts of Unpacking did you have to put the most time and effort into to get it just the way you wanted?
I think the first time I had to render an item that was made of glass, that was really hard. So I guess maybe the culmination of just all the worst things together in one item was Chemex's coffee pot thing. It's made of glass, but it also has a small wooden kind of collar around it, and it's got a complicated shape. The bottom is round, and then it's got this triangular, this conical top, and it's got all these details, and it's got a mesh filter at the top. It's just such a complicated item, and it's already in the kitchen, in the cupboard. So most people probably won't see this item or notice it, which is such a bummer. But it took me many hours to get it right.
Was there anything that you had to fight to get in the game or keep in the game?
I don't think anything was a big fight or anything, because we're all really chill and we're a really close-knit team. Yeah, there wasn't really anything having to stay in the game that someone else was this should go. One of the things I fought for was at the very, very end of development. The game was almost out. We were about to send the final patch for Switch to Nintendo. And I was like, Tim, we need to implement a really simple tutorial for using the replay mode, the quick playback mode, because I noticed that people didn't notice it was there. And Tim was like, we can't do this now. It can introduce bugs. This is way too late. And I'm like, no, Tim, this is really important. A lot of players are missing this. I have a really simple idea for how to do this. We'll just make the button flash. And then when they click it, it won't flash anymore. Just I had a bit of more of a detailed design than that, but just very, very simple. Can we please do this? And Tim's like, fine. And we put it in, and I'm really glad we did, because now people notice the feature.
Unpacking has some amazing sound design. Can you tell me a bit about what went into creating the sound effects and doing the sound design for Unpacking?
Sure, though none of that was me. That was Jeff and his wife, Ange, and also their daughter for a bit. It's a big team effort. They set up a whole home recording studio in their house, just a Foley room, where they had all kinds of surfaces and brought in items and just clicked and clacked them on all the surfaces. They bought a whole kitchen bench top and put it in that room. Yeah, there was a whole ton that went into that, though I think Jeff is the best person to talk to about it. My involvement with audio is the extent of it is I wrote and sang the song in the credits.
How did the scope of Unpacking change from the first pitch to what you currently have now?
Funnily enough, the scope barely changed. It went from 7 levels to 8, although some of the levels ended up growing in size a little bit. I think mainly the last one. The last level was supposed to be like 7 rooms, and it changed into 10, though the new rooms were quite small. And then like the one level that we added to the game that was missing is the smallest level was just 2 rooms. Well, second smallest, I guess, level was just 2 rooms. But the biggest thing was about the scope was, even though we knew what the scope would be from the beginning, and stuck to it quite well and deviated very little, we still took twice as long as we thought that we would take, just because everything takes longer than you'd expect.
Mm-hmm. There's so many little hidden objects that players might pass over. One of my favorite ones is all of the D&D and RPG stuff, because I absolutely love Dungeons and Dragons. What is one of your favorite little objects that most players might just pass over or not see?
Well, today someone discovered something that was important to me, and I'm really glad someone finally picked up on it and told us they noticed. And that's the Artemis Fowl books in the parents' house. So the character had these 2 books when she was a teen. And so when you go back to that room, you can recognize, if you've read the books, you can recognize the covers of those books there. That's my favorite recent one that someone discovered.
What was the biggest design or story challenge that you faced while working on Unpacking?
One of the biggest was with the boyfriend apartment. We were really nervous, or I was really nervous, that people wouldn't realize they can pick up the boyfriend's things. Because in the previous level, we tell you can't pick up the housemates' things. They can't be moved. And so you go into this next level and you go, okay, so the rule is I can't pick up items. But that's not true. That was true in the previous apartment, but not here. So what I did to overcome that was to make the boyfriend's items be totally in the way. He organizes his stuff in a really inefficient way. And it's all over the place and takes up space that you need. So that forces the player to move his stuff. And it had the fun side effect of making the boyfriend seem like a worse boyfriend. It made the feeling of the level of he didn't make space for you all the more pronounced. And so I'm really happy with how that one got resolved. But when we decided what the special thing of each level would be, because that was kind of what we were going for, each level introduces kind of something new. That was the one I was most worried about, because it just felt like it could be a pain point for players. And especially with the diploma, I was worried that people would get too frustrated when they couldn't find out where to put it and just give up. Or once they did realize where it could go, that they'd think, but that's stupid. Why can't I put it on the wall? I thought I could see space there. That seemed like an appropriate space. Or why couldn't I take down his pictures when I could move his other items? These were all things that I was worried that players wouldn't like, or would rub against them the wrong way. But yeah, in the end, it was all fine. We had, to make little changes here and there to make things feel right.
Why did you make the choice to have the only piece of spoken dialogue be that song at the end?
It's almost like a treat. At the end, you get spoken dialogue and you get to see the main character and her partner and their child. Sorry, spoilers. Should have warned in advance. Oh, well. But yeah, you get to see them and you get to hear her singing the song to the characters, to the other characters. And it's just this very emotional moment. And yeah, it just felt appropriate to finish on that, to what now that you've spent all this time with these characters and grown close to them, you are rewarded with a closer glimpse into their lives than you've been afforded so far. And I really just wanted to sing a song.
That's a pretty good reason.
Yeah, I pitched it to Jeff really, really early on, and he was like, okay, sure. And toward the end, we're like, okay, so it's time for that song. And Jeff's like, okay. And I sent him my early recording. He's like, oh, this is actually good. All right. Because I'm not a musician. So I think he was a little nervous, but it worked out okay.
Do you have any plans to add new updates in the future, maybe more levels for the story or an entirely new story with new characters?
No, so I know a lot of people ask for it, especially because it is a short game. But there's like a bunch of reasons why we don't want to add any more content. The main reason being that we feel like this is a complete experience. This is a finished game. It's not like a game as a service sort of thing. It's done. We told the story we wanted to tell. We're really happy with it. And we think anything added to it would take away from it. Now, in terms of adding more stories, like it's possible to do that without like harming the original story. But I feel like it would take away from the impact of the original. And it's just like I told the story I wanted to tell. And I don't really feel like doing all this again. This was a really long journey. It took us 3.5 years to develop this game. And it's just a lot of work. I want to move on to new ideas, make something else next time.
So what would be your advice to new game devs about marketing their games and getting their games out to audiences?
I would say start very early to at least think about it, if not like actually do it. So Unpacking had a really weird journey in that it had a very kind of public development cycle. We posted, like Tim and I posted as we were working on it, and we'd post little updates and gifts and things on our own private accounts. And then eventually we made the Unpacking account and posted our first gift there, and it went viral. And up until that point, this was like a little hobby project for the two of us. But when it went viral and we started being approached by publishers and we ended up getting like a local government grant, it started to take on a life of its own. We're like, okay, this is a viable project. We should make this Witchbeam's next big project and work on this full time. So now we already had hype about the game, and it was 3 years before launch. And so we had to keep this hype going for that long, which was tricky. And it's also risky that the game was known about for that long because of the potential for copycats. But fortunately, people didn't really seem to understand what we were planning to do with the game up until release. Some people got it from the demo, but for the most part, like at least people who would make copycats didn't realize that this was a story game. A lot of people weren't aware it was a story game until the full thing came out. And that was really the thing that made the game special. It's not just about organizing. A copycat couldn't copy that part. And also just the amount of detail and like the density of things in the game is really hard to copy because there's just so much going on. There's over 1,000 items and like 35 completely different rooms. Everything's completely bespoke. It's just too much manual work for someone to crank out a cheap copy. Back to your point about marketing is at least, 6 months before launch, if not more, depending on how you're working, start to build up your presence, have your Steam page, collect wish lists, and keep active. We also have a Discord that we started 3 or 4 months before release that's been really helpful, and a TikTok account. And we just try to drip feed content to our audience for years. And then toward the end, we intensified that more and more until the game finally came out. So just keep people's interest and make people aware of your game and take on kind of any opportunity that's available, as long as you have the bandwidth for it.
Can you tell me a bit about that local government grant and what that was?
Here in Australia, we don't have federal funding, but we've got state funding for games, mainly in Victoria, which is where Melbourne is. And here in Brisbane, it's been pretty intermittent and lower sums and less frequent and fewer. But we managed to get a grant for the development of Unpacking, which was a decent sum of money, is 50K Australian, which I think is 30 something US. it was enough to pay for one artist for 1 year. So just so you understand, like in the scope of how much games cost, it's a very small amount, but for a tiny team like ours, it was still immensely helpful. The rest of the game was funded by Witchbeam, by our studio, with funds from, with the profits from the previous game.
What was your previous game?
So Witchbeam's previous game was Assault Android Cactus. It was not my previous game. I did not work on it, but it's a really cool twin stick shooter, completely different to Unpacking. My partner Tim worked on it, as well as Jeff, who did the audio for Unpacking. He did the audio for Cactus as well. It's a great game. I really love it, but I can take no credit.
Looking back now, what do you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch?
I don't know. I'm really happy with how everything turned out. So it's really hard to say. Maybe like sometimes I think that maybe I would have gone for a simpler art style, because when I first started working on Unpacking, it was an extremely indulgent side project where I was like, I can do whatever I want and take as long as I want to do anything. And no one's going to tell me otherwise. Because before this, I was either working for studios or I was a freelancer. And especially when freelancing, like you're making things for a client and you're essentially being paid by the hour a lot of the time. And so like you need to work as fast and as efficiently as possible and not take risks and make things that you're familiar with already. And Unpacking was just tackling a whole lot of things that I didn't know very well, and like learning a lot of new things and experimenting and spending a ton of time on things that shouldn't have that much time spent on them. And then when we decided we're doing a whole game, it was like, oh God, now I have to make an entire game that's at this quality of art. Mm-hmm. And that ended up taking years, even with the help of other artists. So that's like the one thing where I'm like, in retrospect, maybe I should have gone with a simpler art style. But on the other hand, I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. And people love the art style. And who knows if it would have been quite as successful if the art looked only half as good. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to say.
What was the biggest lesson that you've learned while working on Unpacking?
Oh, man, I learned so much. It's 3.5 years. So it's hard to say what the biggest lesson was. One of them would have to be the thing that I told you before, that everything takes longer than you think. Even when you think that you are overestimating and that you're already like smart enough and experienced enough to estimate correctly, you never estimate correctly. Everything always takes longer. Biggest lesson that I learned was how to keep working on a project that takes this long, like for 3.5 years, how to stay focused and kind of motivated. And that's pretty much just like Tim would always tell me, one foot in front of the other. And that's become a sort of mantra. And you don't look up, you just put one foot in front of the other most of the time. And only every so often, like every few weeks or every few months, you look a little further away, you zoom out and look at the whole map and go, how are we doing? But for the most part, you just take it one step at a time, do the tasks for that day, break them down as much as you can into, like break all your tasks down first into milestones and then into sprints, which are like 2-week lengths of time, and then into days. And you go, okay, this is what I'm doing today. And don't try to look too far ahead. And each 2 weeks, you look at what tasks you got to do for those 2 weeks. And then each milestone that you finish, you look at what you need to do for the next milestone. But on the day-to-day, you're just looking at what you have to do that day. Otherwise, it's just too overwhelming. And especially in the middle of the project, it can feel like it's never, ever going to end. But eventually it does.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to newer game devs trying to get their first game made?
So I think making your first game on your own, or trying to go indie right away, is probably one of the hardest things you could possibly do. My journey was more like to work in a bigger team first, like at mobile studios, and learn a bunch there, and then translate that into indie work. So I would recommend, I know everyone's different, and I know that there are student teams that do really well. So I would never say that it's impossible. I would say it's an extremely hard road, and you're going to learn a lot of lessons the hard way instead of from like other people's experience. So learning while on a bigger team, I think, is an asset. If you want to make an indie game after, I think, that is a possible journey that you can take.
What's next for you? What are you working on now? So
I'm still working on Unpacking. Other things to do with the game. It's not DLC and it's not a sequel, but we're not done quite yet. There's still things to do, like patches and things. After that, I want to take a big, long rest because it sure has been a journey. But yeah, after that, I haven't quite decided yet. I'll probably go off on my own and do something separate to Witchbeam, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that will be yet. I wouldn't say no to working with Witchbeam either because it was really fun.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
No worries. Thank you too.
And that's how the interview went down. I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Make sure to hit that follow or subscribe button. It's different on every platform. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Today's sponsor, Hoffman's Wood Stuff, specializes in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. If you want to get 20% off your next order, use code GDH20. Make sure to check out their Instagram at Hoffman's Wood Stuffs, or you can head on over to their website, hoffmanswoodstuffs.net, by clicking the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.